My name is John Betts, and I am the host of a science talk show at radio station KOPN 89.5 in Columbia, Missouri, called The Skeptical Eye. I also have a background in the water and wastewater treatment field. I worked almost 40 years in the field. I still do some teaching on the side, so I continue to be very interested in the field of water and wastewater treatment. And I'm going to be talking with you about one of my favorite stories in the world of science, in which you can't find a more textbook perfect case of a great scientist using the scientific method. And when we talk about the scientific method, what do we mean? What do we mean by the scientific method? Well, it's simply an organized way that helps scientists, or anyone else for that matter, answer a question or begin to solve a problem. Often you will read that there are 6 parts to the scientific method. It depends on who you are reading when they are writing about this. But the first thing you're going to have is a purpose or a question. What do I mean by that? Well, what do you want to learn? An example would be of what I want to learn is, what doorknob in a school has the most germs, for instance? Does the color of a light bulb affect the growth of grass seeds? Perfect example, 2 perfect examples. I'm then going to do some research on this subject to see what kind of information I can find. Where do I look for information? Well, you can go to books, go to a library, search through the internet, talk to people who may know something about the question that I have. When I have done this preliminary research, at some point when I think I'm starting to get an answer to my question, I have my own thoughts on what may be going on, I'm going to be able to, at that point, form a hypothesis. And another term for a hypothesis is simply an educated guess. I still don't know. I'm simply making an educated guess about the answer was to my original question. So how do I go beyond the hypothesis? Well, I'm going to start performing some sort of an experiment or experiment. And this is actually the fun part for a scientist. You're going to design a test or a procedure to find out if your hypothesis is correct. When I perform an experiment, then will look at all the data that I have come up with, and I am going to see what data I have, and I'm going to do my analysis. And at that point, I'm at a point now where I can make some sort of conclusion. Did the data back up my original hypothesis? And if it does, maybe someday I will be lucky enough that other scientists will say, you now have a theory. I go beyond a hypothesis to an actual theory. And if the data that I have discovered when I have done my research, when I perform my experiment, does not match that original hypothesis, then I've got to be willing to say, I'm going to have to go back to the drawing board and start from the very beginning again. That is the wonder and the beauty of science. And that is what the scientific method is. And that brings us to the Broad Street Pump waterborne disease outbreak and the story of my absolutely favorite scientist in the world, the late, great Dr. John Snow of London. And I want to say a little something about London at the time of the 1854 cholera outbreak. London at that time was a city of 2.5 million people. The population in this city was crowded into a 30-mile circumference area. In London in 1854 was actually the largest city on earth. And what is interesting, at this time, the largest city on earth had a level of sanitation that wasn't any better than any other giant city in Europe at that time. And in fact, probably the level of sanitation wasn't much better than it had been during medieval times. It's just an incredible thing to imagine. And this city, this largest city on earth, had no sewerage system. Imagine that, 2.5 million people, no sewerage property, open land. There were mounds of human waste that were sometimes 10, 15 feet high. Now, during Victorian times, there were a number of theories about where this human disease came from. And the source of choice was, there was something called miasmatism. And you'll read about this in the novels, the great novels of Charles Dickens, who wrote at that time. He would talk about the miasma. And what that meant was, it was a theory that disease spread through filth, primarily through stench. That was the miasma given off by this excrement and decomposing organic matter. It was simply, it was the fog that you would see in old movies made of Charles Dickens's novels, where characters would walk around in a fog in London, and it was the miasma that was carried through the stench and in the air. And it was the belief in miasma that led the London Board of Health in 1848 to have all this waste finally. They had a great solution: dump it out into the gutters, and then you let it wash to the rivers. And that was the source of water for a huge portion of the population of London, was to take water from the rivers, as well as private pumps in the city. And in fact, were there toilets at this time? Yes, there were. This was just about the time when human flush toilets came into existence. They didn't help the matter at all. They just helped remove the waste from the house, but it was still winding up in the rivers around London, in the Thames and the other bodies of water. So what we had was a major problem at this time. Of course, we know there's another theory of disease, and where disease comes from, and we call it now in modern times the germ theory of disease. But at the time of the 1854 Broad Street pump incident, that was a theory that remained yet to be proven. At the end of 1854, there was a major cholera outbreak in Britain, and Dr. John Snow's epidemiological investigation of this outbreak established a causal link between the disease and drinking water. This is the absolutely miraculous, incredible thing that John Snow did. He actually was able to come up with a link between the deadly cholera and drinking water by using the scientific method. Snow was actually born in a small London village in a farm. His father was a farmer, and like many people at that time, he learned his profession as a doctor by assisting a succession of village surgeons. And in the very first cholera outbreak in England in 1831, Snow, working with one of these doctors, had his first opportunity to see the effects of cholera firsthand, and to deal with a doctor who was trying to help people who were suffering and dying from this. He moved to London in 1838. He became a member of the Royal College of Surgeons. He set up practice finally at an office at 54 Fifth Street in Soho. And it was an incredible piece of both coincidence and luck, because this was the center of the site of the great cholera outbreak of 1854, right in the neighborhood where John Snow had his office. the time of the great outbreak of 1854, he was ready to get out and start walking the streets, and he knew what he wanted to investigate. He believed, John Snow believed in the power of statistics. He wanted to know how cholera behaved within the body and how it was spread from person to person. Most importantly, who got sick? Why did they become sick? No one else had done this. So when the outbreak in 1854 began in this large area of London called Soho, and the outbreak began on August the 31st of 1854. And in fact, it began only within blocks of where John Snow's office was. And he immediately started walking the streets and asking questions. Snow begins to suspect that there is one or more of the street pumps that were the source of the contamination. He was almost becoming positive this has something to do with drinking water. And not only did people take water from the river, these London streets were full of neighborhood street pumps, handled pumps. People did not have their own private water supplies. You would either draw water from some sort of a pump next to a river, or you had these street pumps. He was becoming suspicious that there were street pumps. Now, he discovers from London's weekly report that nearly all the recorded deaths that seem to be occurring in this first week of this outbreak seem to be occurring between the corner of Broad and Cambridge Streets, which was very close to where his office was. And within 10 days, the death toll had climbed to 700 people. At the height of the deaths, Snow began going from doorway to doorway, knocking on doors and trying to get information from those who had not been stricken by the cholera. He talked to family members, to friends, to neighbors, and he tried to collect information and what he wanted to know. And the list of questions that he asked people was, what do you know about what these people were drinking in the day or two before they had come down with the cholera symptoms? Where did they get their drinking water? He was able to determine very rapidly that all of these victims were habitual drinkers of the Broad Street water pump. Now, what is interesting, there was a workhouse across the street from the Broad Street pump. It was called the Poland Street Workhouse, and there were 400 residents that lived there, only steps away from the Broad Street pump. There was also a brewery right next to the workhouse where beer was brewed. And there was 70 employees that worked there. No one from those two locations had come down sick. That was a big flaw in Snow's hypothesis that the source of the outbreak was this water pump. Everyone else was getting sick, and they came down with the cholera, and they have died. And they most definitely had, within the last 24 hours, taken water from the Broad Street pump. But nobody from the workhouse with 500 people or the 70 brewery employees had come down sick. He had a problem there. The workhouse, Snow ultimately discovered, was they had their own private well. They did not, the 500 residents there weren't using the Broad Street pump. And the brewery employees were given free beer. That was one of the perks of working at the brewery. None of them had drank water from the Broad Street pump in the days preceding the outbreak of the cholera. Snow once again felt he had come up with something. There was an emergency meeting of the board of the St. James Parish who controlled the pumps in the Soho area, and Snow laid out his evidence that the Broad Street pump was the source of that outbreak and he requested that the pump handle be removed. The board of the parish was skeptical, but they found Snow's evidence very persuasive. They had a vote, and in that second week of September, they removed that handle from the Broad Street pump. Now, what is interesting about this is it is believed, and the story is, and the myth is, Snow did this. Using the scientific method, he made a correlation with his data between the deaths, the cholera deaths, and the fact that water seemed to be the source, and he had found the pump. Everyone had drank, all the people who had died and came down deadly ill had drinking water from this pump. He convinces the people in this community to remove the pump handle. The disease is so important about what Snow did. Well, what he was able to do, what Snow did by using this scientific method, he most certainly did find the source of that problem. And what he should really be honored for and remembered for, what he was able to do by presenting that evidence to this governing board who controlled the water supply. A public institution makes an informed intervention in response to a disease outbreak based on sound science, not superstition. The decision to remove that handle based on a methodical survey of social patterns of the epidemic was the first time any institution, a public institution, made a decision based on the work of a scientist in this way. That is the greatness of what John Snow did, and that's why he is remembered. Ironically, the health department of London, or what passed for an health department, never did believe that Snow's theory was correct. They continued for decades to maintain it was miasma. It was the miasma that killed in 1854 and continued to kill. But history has remembered John Snow and the greatness of what he did. John Snow did not live to see his work and theories vindicated. He died on 9 June 1858, and it wasn't until 1883 that a German scientist by the name of Robert Koch identified a spiral-shaped bacterium responsible for cholera, the Vibrio cholerae. Doesn't matter. John Snow made this first epidemiological investigation. His evidence was solid. He knew he was right, and he was right. That is the greatness of John Snow. This is the story of the Broad Street pump incident.